Thanks, y'all, for being here. Welcome to our panel discussion. This panel is organized around a book called Appalachian Reckoning, which you see some of the panelists have before you. This book was edited and put together as a response to a book called Hillbilly, Elegy, which was published in 2016, which created something of a stir in Appalachian studies for a variety of reasons that you'll hear tonight. The book, Appalachian Reckoning, is a response to Hillbilly, Elegy. So that's what we're doing here tonight. We have three panelists, very distinguished people in Appalachian studies, and I appreciate them all being here tonight. I'm supposed to mention that somebody has attendance slips back in the back there. If you're a student and you need a verification that you are here, afterwards, that's where you'll find them, in the back. Thank you. Our three panelists. We'll start here with Tony Harkins in the middle. Tony Harkins is one of the co-editors of Appalachian Reckoning. He is also a professor of history and American studies at Western Kentucky University, where he teaches courses in popular culture, 20th century United States history, and again, American studies. To his left is Ivy Brashear, who is a graduate of this fine institution. She now is the Appalachian Transition Director at the Mountain Association for Community Economic Development, located in Berea, called MACED. Her work there with MACED focuses on shifting the narrative of Appalachia. She is also a freelance journalist who has written for several online and print journals. She is from Viper in Perry County. And finally, we have Robert Gipe. Robert Gipe teaches at Southeast Kentucky Community and Technical College. Did I get all that right? All right, good. He is also active in many performance and art groups in Harlan County, Kentucky. Particularly, he is producer of the Higher Ground Community Performance Series, which you may have heard of. It's made quite an impact in the region and in Appalachian studies in general. Robert Gipe lives now in Harlan County. He grew up in Kingsport, Tennessee. He's also the author of a book called Trampoline, which my Appalachian Studies class is reading at this very moment, I hope. And its successor, Weed Eater, which came out in 2018. So I'll turn it over to them. I believe Dr. Harkins.
Yeah. Whoa. Well, thank you all for coming, and we're just delighted to see such a big audience and to be able to share some of this book with you. So this is a book that, as Rob said, came out in response to Hillbilly Elegy. It came out of the Appalachian Studies Association panel on discussions about it, and which I had created and that Ivy was on. And after that, West Virginia Press reached out and said, that seems like something that could really be a book. And then it was joined with another project on Appalachian writing that Meredith McCarroll, my co-editor, was working on. And so that's how the book came out. And the introduction sort of lays all this out. So I thought I'd just read from little excerpts from the introduction to give you sort of a taste of this. And then Ivy and Robert will read sections from their contributions. So this is called Why This Book? So this is a book born out of frustration. This is a book born out of hope. It attempts to speak for no one and to give voice to many. This is a book that could have emerged without Hillbilly Elegy, but it was also created in the explicit context of the post-election, 2016, post-Hillbilly Elegy moment. It therefore attempts to respond to those who have felt they understand Appalachia now that they have read Hillbilly Elegy, and to push back against and complicate those understandings. It is meant to open a conversation about why that book struck such a deep nerve with many in the region, but it is not meant to demonize J.D. Vance. Instead, the contributors to this book prioritize focusing on the region, reclaiming some of the talk about Appalachia, and offering ideas through the voices of many who have deep, if varied, lived experiences in and of Appalachia. So we have contributors in the book that are scholars. We have writers as well. Some of it's narration and personal stories. Some of it is scholarship, poetry, and photography. And so we've tried to have a kind of blend of all these things to give the best window into the complications of Appalachia. As citizens and scholars, Appalachians have been fighting against gross simplifications and stereotypes since at least the early 19th century. And this work should be considered only the latest effort to challenge such views. And this is something I've explored in my book, Hillbilly, A Cultural History of an American Icon, looking at the history of the image of the hillbilly and its meanings and uses. Some contributors emphasize the need to challenge distorting and debilitating stereotypes. Some stress the need to face the region's problems forthrightly and squarely. Some are quiet and contemplative. Others are angry. Yet, despite what the majority of our contributors find to be Hillbilly Elegy's flaws and even damages, they share the sense that the broader public rediscovery of the region, that Hillbilly Elegy and the construction of what one of our contributors calls Trumpalachia, the construction of these things have engendered, so should also be seen as an opportunity and a chance to reclaim Appalachia and to help those unfamiliar with the region to recognize its complexities and diversities. And so the book was sort of born out of a series of questions that we had and that our contributors had, which I lay out here. What about Vance in his book accounts for the explosion of interest in Appalachia and its people in this historical moment of national political turmoil, ongoing historical moment? Why have the ideas in Hillbilly Elegy caused such a firestorm in the region? What can we learn about both actual Appalachia and the way it is perceived from these reactions and debates? What does it mean in the 21st century to be Appalachian? And perhaps most significantly, as our contributor poet Jeff Mann asks in his poem in here, what other Appalachian voices have been drowned out in the flood of attention that Vance and his book have garnered, and how can these voices be heard? And so we're hoping this book is in part a response to that. Collectively, the works in here try to push back against the Hillbilly Elegy phenomenon that defines the region in a sort of singular way and almost completely in terms of backwardness, ignorance, isolation, violence, dependency, passivity, and ultimately as a place of social, economic, and cultural death, as a name like Hillbilly Elegy suggests. This book instead presents a very different Appalachia and Appalachians as a place and people with undeniable problems, but also intellectual vitality, diversity, in terms of ideology, gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, and a powerful resilience. And it is these characteristics that are lost often in imagining Hillbilly Elegy as the sole window into the Appalachian experience. And so the book tries to give you multiple different windows into it, and we'll see from our other contributors here. Thank you.
Me next?
You next.
All right. Well, it's always good to be back at EKU. As you heard, I'm a proud graduate of here. It's been a lot longer than I want to admit, so I won't. But I'm happy to be back here to talk about this book and to talk about Appalachian images and Appalachian portrayals. Really, I feel like my career has really been about what are Appalachian portrayals and why are they important, and why is it important to really think about those portrayals critically. For me, being from the region, I grew up with these images being put out there about my place and about my people. And I remember being very angry about those images most of the time because that wasn't the Appalachia that I knew. It wasn't the people that I knew, and it felt very simplistic to me and not complex enough to be real. And we still find that this happens today. A lot of my work is about talking to reporters and journalists who are interested in an explanation for something that is happening. After 2016, it was, why did Trump happen? And we got a lot of phone calls from national reporters about that. They always come with a particular idea of the story that they want to cover. They're asking to talk to particular people, which often fall into very specific tropes about the region. And sometimes they listen to us when we say it's actually more complex than that, and sometimes they don't. So the reason I wanted to be a part of this book and was a part of the panel was because I feel it's very important to be complex about the stories we tell about a group of people and about a place, no matter what that group of people is or no matter where that place is. It's important to have a really complete story because that's the only way you really understand what it is like to be in that place and to be those people. And also, there's a lot of power that's involved in the images that are taken from this region and from other regions of the country and the world. It's a lot easier, for instance, to take a lot of wealth from people and take a lot of wealth from a place. If the images that are coming out of that place, that are being told about that place, are of simple people, backward people who need saving, who aren't worth saving, who don't deserve to have wealth of their own. So it's really important to me to combat those narratives, those simplistic narratives, and oftentimes false and misleading narratives. So I'm going to read a little bit from the piece that I wrote in here. This is a piece that starts out talking about my Granny Della, and I always like to bring her into a space, if at all possible, because she deserves all the praise in the world. So I'll read a little bit about this from my piece, and then we'll see what Robert has to say. Della Combs Brashear had had enough. She backed her Cadillac long ways across the one-lane road in front of her house, lit the Virginia Slim in her mouth, pulled her .38 pistol from her purse, and waited, stone-faced and determined, for the next coal truck to come along. The trucks had been running day and night up and down the head of the left fork of Mesas Creek in front of her house every day for weeks. They were coating every bit of furniture in and outside her home with a thick layer of gray coal dust. Her kitchen counter, the rocking chair that she sat in while watching The Price is Right in the morning and Wheel of Fortune in the evening, the porch swing, the hanging ferns that encircled the porch. Nothing could escape the intrusive, insidious dust kicked up from the road by the trucks as they barreled back and forth to the strip mine on the overlooking mountain. The dust swirled in thick gray clouds around the house, seeping in the front door and closed windows. It buried everything. No matter Della's efforts to keep the tides at bay, coal dust tsunamis were inescapable. There's only so many times a woman bound to the code of Clorox, Pledge, and Windex can clean up after someone else's mess before the time comes to act. She wasn't afraid of jail. They'll give me 3 hot meals a day and a place to sleep, she proclaimed to my dad when he tried to persuade her to move her one-woman barricade. And she wasn't really making a political stand against an oppressive thieving industry. She was more interested in defending her home from unwanted, unclean intrusions. She didn't make the truck stop forever, but they did turn around and go home that infamous day when she couldn't take it any longer. A small victory for a woman who fought for nearly everything she had. Fierce is a good word for Della Combs. Fiercely loyal to her children and grandchildren. She once threatened a coach at the local high school so he would give her son a Letterman jacket with that .38 pistol, I want to add. Fierce advocate for doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. Legend has it that she kept most of the hungry children in Christopher, Kentucky, fed their entire childhoods. Fierce mountain woman who had big dreams of city life, playing piano and singing in Chicago or New York City, but who instead married a man her mother picked for her before she graduated high school. She stayed with him until the end of her life because of a fierce sense of duty. To me, though, she was Granny Della, a fierce storyteller who had the most enormous zest for life and love, with the heart to match. Her laugh seemed to always echo off the walls and reverberate off the hills that held the holler. Music was her one true love, second only to the fierce, expansive love she had for her family. Made-up songs about everyday life rolled over her lips as easily as the fog rolls into the valleys. She would often catch a word someone spoke to her and trail off into a song containing the word. "The sun sure is shining bright today," someone would say. She'd answer in melody, in the pines where the sun never shines. She always wore pink lipstick and white powder and clip-on earrings. She had arthritis in her toes from a youth spin in high heels with matching dresses. She was a beautiful woman. Once she took her two firstborn to have their portraits made in Hazard, and the photographer was so struck by her beauty, he insisted on taking her portrait too. She's wearing pearls in the photo. She was always put together like that. She maintained a standing hair appointment every Friday at Dascom's Beauty Shop in Vico. She always had short hair, which she preferred, even for her only daughter, my mom, who preferred the opposite of almost everything her parents wanted. Granny Della got her driver's license and earned her GED when she was in her 40s. She kept a newspaper clipping in a drawer that was a picture of her and her fellow GED recipients that year. She lived a life of confinement in some ways, always meeting others' expectations and sidelining her own dreams in the process. Her middle age was about reclaiming her independence, creating a life outside her husband and her children. She was and remains one of the fiercest, strongest women I've ever known. I grew up her neighbor. We lived just up the hill from her, and I knew her door was always open to me. I could run down the hill and into her house without warning any day, and she would welcome me in, offering me food and conversation. I was often in her kitchen as she put up peaches in Ziploc bags for winter, or watered her beloved hanging ferns that encased her porch. She played piano every Sunday at Lone Pine Baptist Church, the family church founded by my great-grandfather, less than a mile from my home. When she told me I had piano fingers, I felt so special, like she had chosen me to carry on her music. Sometimes Mom and I would visit in the evenings and watch Wheel of Fortune with her. In the summer, her porch would be full of family who lived within a mile radius, great aunts and uncles, cousins, neighbors. Life updates and family stories would be swapped late into the gloaming hours of the evening. Granny Della was gregarious and outspoken, once telling a man to get a life and get a job, and another time telling Lone Pine's preacher he was wrong about God not giving people talent they didn't have to learn. Everyone knew where they stood with her and where she stood on certain issues. Mostly everyone knew you didn't cross her or disrespect her. They revered her and praised her and followed her lead. She was one fierce mountain woman, and it showed. But I would never, ever, in my wildest dreams or imaginings, disrespect her in any format because of her fierceness by calling her a lunatic, as J.D. Vance so often refers to his mama in his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy. The way he describes this woman, whom he claims to revere and credits as the reason he made it out of his low-income life in suburban Ohio and into Yale Law School, is shameful. It displays a willingness to sell out his family members by tapping into a long history of distorted, false, and intentionally made stereotypical images of Central Appalachia that have been imposed on the region by outside media makers for nearly 300 years. Vance's willingness to tap into that long history of the place and people who live there proves his endgame: monetary gain and national notoriety to bolster a potential political run for office, supported, of course, by his carefully created and curated self-image as the so-called expert on the white working class of Appalachia, a place in which he has never lived. However, what's more insidious about his rise to fame, on a book largely made up of descriptions of Appalachian stereotypes he attempts to pass off as universal truths, is the fact that people will read his book and assume all Appalachian people, if they are smart, are trying to actively run away from their culture. They will understand it to be less than and the people they came from to be crazy lunatics. Elegy has no class, no heart, and no warmth. It is a poorly written appropriation of Appalachian stereotypes about violent, ignorant, and slovenly hillbillies who refuse to help themselves despite having every opportunity to do so. The systemic challenges Appalachia faces, such as poverty, drug addiction, economic collapse, and poor public health, have been caused almost entirely by the capitalist greed of extraction companies. From salt to timber to coal to gas, absentee companies have stripped Appalachia of every resource from which they can make a buck and left very little wealth behind. Just like my Granny Della having to Clorox the coal dust grime from her porch furniture, Appalachian people have been left to clean up the various economic, social, public health, and environmental messes extraction companies have dumped upon us, leaving very few internal or external resources from which to build. Big media have highlighted and exploited these systemic challenges and problems in recent years and used them to identify Appalachia as the scapegoat for all of America's social and economic ills. If we can just solve the problem of Appalachia, they posit, we can save America. Naturally, since big media seemingly always choose the path of least resistance, J.D. Vance has become their Appalachian darling, appearing on news shows and on panels of so-called Middle America experts. As a result, hundreds of years of lived Appalachian experience and almost 50 years of dedicated Appalachian scholarship have been stepped over by the national media in favor of the misleading, oversimplified, and stereotypical narrative about Appalachia that fits their preconceived notions of the region. A self-named death poem about a place that most people have long since already buried in their hearts and minds. And I'll stop there.
That's pretty good, wasn't it? We'll stand up so I can see what's coming. I'm going to jump around in mine. This is called How Appalachian I Am. I worked at a chemical plant a couple summers driving forklift and servicing extruder operators. They were making plastic pellets, and two of them became my friends. One time when they got off second shift, Bear and Moon went frog gigging. They fixed tridents the breadth of a bullfrog's shoulders to 8-foot-long golf course flag sticks. They walked that night beside creeks and ponds with miners' lights fixed to their belts, shining their lights at the water's edge. When the light hit a bullfrog, his croaking stopped. "There he is," one of them would say, and the flag stick fork would plunge into the frog's back. Bear, I should say that I didn't grow up frog gigging. Bear and Moon made a circle of a wire hanger, bent hooks in either end, and strung the frogs they caught on the wire, gouging it through the frog's bottom jaw. When they returned to their vehicle with a gang of frogs on the wire, they took each frog and halved him at the waist with a big knife and saved the legs and threw the rest in the weeds. They advised that one soak the legs in salt water before frying them, lest they jump out of the pan, looking for their lost frog. The extruder operator named Bear is from Lee County, Virginia, which borders Harlan County, which is where I live. Once a young woman took a community college class in Harlan. I was her instructor and required her to record an oral history. She recorded one with her father, who described for the young woman how his father, the young woman's grandfather, a coal mine operator, had signed a $700 million contract to provide coal to the chemical plant in Kingsport. $700 million over 30 years is how the man on the recording put it. Many people in Harlan County mine coal, earn their living to help that young woman's grandfather honor that contract. So the chemical plant was a part of Eastman Kodak, which so that back when we did all our photographs on paper with film, we got rich off of that. A lot of people did. Probably many of them had their picture made during that time. Some probably drank liquor. This essay also starts with a loving description of a liquor store. I cannot say for certain. I do know this: Harlan County was mostly dry during the time of the $700 million, and that the man with the wavy hair told me he sold liquor to Harlan County bootleggers during that time, including one, Mag Bailey, who, it is said, put several Harlan County lawyers through law school and spent very little, if any, time in jail. One gathers it is easy to die working in a coal mine, particularly an underground coal mine. Roofs fall, ribs roll. There are explosives and thick cables carrying killing amounts of electricity. There are deadly and volatile gases. Miners need to be on their toes. Miners need to look out for each other. They need to know they can trust one another, not to lose their heads. So they test one another. They do things like put motor oil in one another's shampoo bottles. There are stories of them strapping young miners together lip to lip with electrical tape when they cannot get along, and leave them lying in mine passages until they kiss and make up. There are stories of nailing one another's dinner buckets to the belt line. A miner who cannot tolerate this is not likely to keep his head when death comes knocking. That is the kind of thing most of us would like to know ahead of time, particularly if we knew we would be braving death on a daily basis. It is not as easy to die on the job in a plastic factory as it is in a coal mine, but there is still danger. Once a man got his hand pulled off in a plastics extruder, and his coworker had to go back and get his wedding ring off a severed finger. And an inattentive operator can destroy tens of thousands of dollars of material in a minute by dropping a raw batch into an extruder, or taking too long a break and letting a hopper overflow onto the factory floor. And so there was hazing in the plastics factory too. For example, a forklift driver had to go outside to get pallets on which material was transported at least once a shift. It was not unheard of for one's fellow operators to fill the plastic bag that lined the 1,000-pound boxes with water and drop it on a forklift operator's head from the top of the building when they went out for pallets. The steel cage that covered the top of the forklift would protect the operator from a broken neck, but not the shattering of the bag and the drowning of the forklift operator by 100 gallons of water. I may have mentioned earlier I was a forklift driver, and the fact some of this hazing is meanness for meanness' sake. Some of it is to stave off boredom. But there's also the lesson in the hazing that this is serious, dangerous work, and that a certain capacity for rough treatment is part of being able to stick with the job, part of being a reliable coworker. Both the plastic factory I worked in and most of the coal mines I've heard about are predominantly male workspaces. One need not have much imagination to recognize in the hazing a certain macho relish in being tough enough to endure the challenges of the job, and a certain amount of defending the space against those who might not immediately fit a relatively narrow definition of who can do the work. Both the mines and the plastic factory, as I've experienced them, are classic creations of industrial capitalism and the particular strain of patriarchy supporting and supported by industrial capitalism. My mother married when she was 19. She was 24 when I was born. She went back to college when I was old enough to look after my little brother. She went to East Tennessee State University and earned a degree and became a registered nurse. My mother was anxious about her own intelligence and her ability to graduate from college. She finished first in her nursing class. Her father was a vice president at the chemical plant in Kingsport, and her mother never worked outside the home. My father married when he was 24. He graduated from the University of Tennessee, which he attended on a basketball scholarship. Go Vols. My father's mother died when he was 4. He was raised by his father's sister, then his father and stepmother. My father attended 4 different high schools in 2 states. His father was a storekeeper for the W.T. Grant Company in Asheville. My father became a supervisor at the chemical plant. He managed the distribution of several warehouses worth of the raw material that goes into cigarette filters. He died, like many, many people in Kingsport, of cancer. When my mother graduated high school, her parents sent her to college in northern Ohio, to a school chosen in part because of its distance from my father. When they got together anyway, there was a big wedding, and my parents received a set of silver from her parents as a gift. My mother always told me her mother told her they would get the silver engraved if the marriage lasted. It did, and the silver remains unengraved. My mother died in 2016. She once ate all the cream out of a pack of Oreos and fed the cookies to the dog while she was talking on the telephone. She once had her doctor wire her jaw shut to help her lose weight. She taught newborns to swim twice. She did that twice. She took in my cousins when they were in trouble and had nowhere to go, even when she did not agree with what they were doing. She took a job as the patient advocate at the hospital where she was born, and with unflinching diligence brought complaints about the medical care the hospital's patients received to the people who could do something about it. When she retired, the hospital discontinued her position. My mother harbored lawbreakers, spoke for the voiceless, confronted power, did what she thought was right no matter what it cost her. and perhaps most courageously made her own sense of the world. Once near the end of her life, I was driving her to my brother's house in Wise, Virginia, and a pickup truck drove by with a Confederate flag mounted in its bed. My mother watched the truck sail by, flapping in the breeze, and she said, "Why would you do that when you know it hurts people's feelings?" My mother was at once the most fearless and nervous person I've ever known. For all the stands she took in her life, she also lived in constant conviction that our doom was nigh. If we did not call her on a semi-hourly basis, we had to be dead. If there was ice on any road anywhere in North America, we needed to stay home unless we were coming to visit her. In her mind, there was no point to frog gigging, that only trouble could come from it. The same was true of drinking, staying out late, and venturing too far from Kingsport. She rarely traveled without taking her own food, and her favorite part of any vacation was getting home. Worry was the motor of her existence. When she passed, the funeral took place in the same church where she was baptized and married. There were 400 people there. My brother and I told all the funny stories on her we could think of. People were laughing and crying. She would have loved it. In the receiving line, we heard a bunch more stories we'd never heard. One woman told me that when she first moved to Kingsport, she went to her first Kingsport party, and when she walked in, there was a woman dancing on the table. Her hostess said, "Don't worry, that's Barbara Gipe. She doesn't drink." So then I talk about our theater project. Let's see. So we had these two women, one African American who, there's a scene where the storekeeper just won't acknowledge her existence, and then another woman who's from a well-to-do family but gets on drugs, and the judge says, "What are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. You're from a good family." And she says, "Drugs don't care who you are. They treat everybody the same." But so we needed to find some way for these two women to make friends, and it turned out they were both pack rats. To make the connection between these two characters, we used a story from my experience with my mother. One day I went with her to a safe deposit box, and there with all her jewelry and money papers, there's an umbrella and a bag of cheese doodles. She left them in there, she said, because one day she came in a hurry eating cheese doodles for lunch and was embarrassed to walk out with them. I was worried that when my mother came to see the play, her feelings would be hurt by that story being in it. I asked her afterward what she thought of the play. She said, "Oh, Robbie, it was wonderful." I asked her what she thought of the safety deposit box story. She said, "See, I told you I wasn't the only one who does that." My mother lived long enough to see me, encouraged by the reception our plays received, go to the Appalachian Writers Workshop in Hyman Settlement School and to other writing workshops. She lived to see me publish a novel and read and get fussed over about it, and this made her very happy. To sum all this up and get to my topic, which is how Appalachian I am, I would say this. I reckon I'm more Appalachian than some and less Appalachian than others. I'd say I'm Appalachian enough. I'd say I was raised by both my mother and father to make my own sense of the world. And I was raised to make meaning by telling stories and listening to stories. I was taught that meaning is complex and shifting and difficult to state. And the more stories one adds to one's thinking, the harder it gets to make meaning. And that is good, and a good thing to keep in mind when one sees something new, that one won't be able to make any sense of a thing until one hears not one but many stories about it. And I was raised to know that one good thing about stories is that one person might make one meaning out of a story, and another person might take a different meaning from it. And I was raised to believe this ability to make our own meaning out of the world is what freedom is, and what joy is. And meaning making is a right we all have. I was raised that we are all obliged to work to make sure everyone has the right and the opportunity to tell their own story. To tell their own story and hear everyone else's. The easy story to hear and the difficult. The happy and the sad. The comic and the tragic. And we are all obliged to work to make sure each of us has the right to hear and tell all the stories, and each make our own meaning out of them and the world. And if we don't work toward that end, we are cheating our neighbor, and we are cheating ourselves of the joy of living, and should be ashamed of ourselves, and should be forced to take long car rides in cars with no radio for all of eternity with people who grew up in places where they didn't learn how to tell stories.
Okay, so with that, wonderful stories, we'll open it up for any questions you have for any of us or all of us. Yes, sir.
Both of you told stories about very strong Appalachian women. Is that a stereotype or is that typical?
Both. You know, there's a reason that women in Appalachia were so strong like that. They had to hold it together. Jesse Wilkerson, who's an Appalachian scholar out of Mississippi by way of East Tennessee, wrote a really wonderful book called To Live Here You Have to Fight, and it's all about women's role in activism in the region. And what she talks about is the caregiving role that women had, and that it's a part of the economy, because without their caregiving role, their caregiving economy, men couldn't go off and work and support this broader economy. So, I mean, oftentimes women just had to keep everything together, the household, the children, their husbands, the social engagements that they were a part of, going to church. So they had to be strong, and they had to do what we described to be that way. I think also, you know, that can be oversimplified, very much so. And the complexity of why they had to be that way can be lost in those oversimplifications, for sure. I don't know if you have anything to add, Robert?
I mean, you know, you only have so much material in life, and that was just what I had.
Yeah, that's part of it.
I think also,
You were influenced by a strong Appalachian woman.
yeah, that's right. I think also, you know, my approach to being a part of this project was just to be very specific about how I came to be who I am. And also, I mean, you know, the moral of the story of my story was just, it was less about that particular book. I mean, I think the thing that was frustrating to me was not that J.D. Vance wrote that book, but that so many people on both the, I think one of the things that kills me about Hillbilly Elegy is how many people on the left swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. I mean, I'm not, at this point, I'm far less concerned with the motivations of people who are inclined to vote for candidates on the right. I'm interested in what happened to the friggin' left. You know, that how have we come to break faith with people, with working people, to such a degree that they feel so alienated from the goals of the Democratic Party. And I think that, you know, so anyway, that's kind of veering from the strong. Well, my mother did raise me to call a spade, I will say that. She, to talk truth to power, you know, is something that I think that, you know, both of the character women that were in our essays bred in us. And yeah, but I mean, you know, that was my thing. It's just like, it's both just telling your individual story, and also how you tell it. You know, how do you, I mean, I've called my mother crazy before. I felt bad when Ivy said it. I would call her to her face. And if you've ever seen a woman feed a whole pack of Oreo cookies to a dog, it would call some things into question for you. But she wasn't, and I loved her to death. And you know, and I think, I mean, and that's the thing too. We all express our love in different ways within families. But that's enough.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am. Do you want? I don't think you can stay ahead of it. It's a $100 million movie or whatever it is. J.D. Vance's book was on the bestseller list for 60, 70 weeks. This book has done incredibly well for what it's been, but it's not that. It's never going to be that. But I think we continue to speak back to it in whatever ways we can. My colleague, my co-editor Meredith, wrote a piece in, what was it in? I can't remember, Columbia Journalism Review, I think, and she's done something on USA Today or something like that as well, on sort of trying to complicate these ideas and try to sort of recognize that, you know, this vision of Appalachia is not the only one, and the idea that it is the only one is really the biggest problem. It's, as Robert said, I don't think it's J.D. Vance's, people don't have a problem with J.D. Vance telling his story, but when he starts to talk about, as the subtitle is, a people and a region in crisis, a family in a region in crisis, then he's fusing together his own experience with an entire area that covers 13 states and millions of people, and that's the problem, that becomes the only story. And so we're trying hard in this book to have many different stories from many different Appalachians, and what it's like to be in Appalachia, what it's like to leave Appalachia, and what parts of Appalachia remain with you, and to just recognize the complexity that is the world, rather than this sort of simple story. And hopefully the movie will have some sense of that. You know, it's a huge director, huge actors. Hopefully it won't just reinforce the simplistic story.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. But
Yeah.
the simple story has made a lot of money for a lot of people for a lot of time. So, you know, that's the that's the opposite side.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll add to that in my work, as I said, I deal with a lot of national reporters who are coming to this place to explain some problem that the nation faces. And that has been true for a long time, for at least 50 years, since the War on Poverty started. And we consistently get these calls and these emails. Just recently, Diane Sawyer's doing a 10-year review of her Children of the Mountains special that she did on ABC 10 years ago. She came calling. We get these calls a lot. And a lot of times what we have to do is educate them about this place and the history of this place and why we are in the position we're in today. It takes a lot of time, but we feel like it's really worth it. And sometimes it pays off in the story that they end up telling. But it is really hard to stay ahead of it. We haven't found a good way to do that yet. We're right now trying to think about how are we going to field these calls next year when there's another presidential election and the Senate race in Kentucky. But it's hard. It's hard to stay ahead of that. I don't think you ever do, like you said, Tony.
Have you all sent your book to Oprah?
Have we?
We've asked to have it sent to Oprah. The press, yeah. Oprah would do wonderful things.
I'm glad Robert brought up the discussion about the progressive side more was the group that really embraced Elegy. And there's an excellent essay in the book about why that was. Can you both, all three of you, expand on your thoughts about why you think the progressive side is so excited about Elegy, and how to explain why maybe it wasn't something to get excited about? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that it's out of ignorance mostly, right? And it's out of the sense that people and by progressive, I mean, it's generally people in the Northeast or California who are elites, frankly, went to fancy schools, travel in those circles, only see those people for the most part. And therefore, they just don't know anything about what the complexity of places are. And they were just stunned and shocked by the Trump candidacy, phenomenon, election. Much of this was happening before he was elected. It was just like, how could this person possibly be winning? And they were searching for answers, and the simple answer was that these people are basically too ignorant to know better to vote against their interests. And it wasn't that, as Robert says, the left has not found a way to connect to working people across the country, and rural people in particular. But it must be some other explanation, right? And so there's got to be a simple answer. So the simple answer is that these people are just trapped in their place and time. They want to return to a past which was, you know, patriarchal and all about heavy industry, and that's all they cared about. And, you know, there are some people like that, of course. But that wasn't, you know, and therefore that is the entirety of the region. As Dwight Billings points out, the place that had the highest percentage of votes for Trump was Staten Island, New York, right? So there were really high numbers in Appalachia too. I mean, we can't hide that. But it's not just, you know, it's not that simple answer. And the idea that, well, these people, if they had any brains, they would leave. And, you know, the solution Appalachia's, one of them said was U-Haul, right? And that suggests this idea that you just abandon places and you abandon people, and it also reflects a culture where people don't have a connection to land and family and community and heritage that matters to them, you know? And that all those things are expendable in the pursuit of advancement and progress or whatever, or should be. And so I think it just loses all of that, all the richness of these stories and these lives are rooted in that idea that of being of a place and time and community. And I think that's something that, as you move into those highest echelons, you kind of sacrifice, right? So I think that's part of the explanation.
As a part of, as a result of being in this book, I got asked to write an op-ed for the New York Times about 2016, and that was an eye-opener for me. Just the editorial process, you know, I had to rewrite it 8 or 9 times, and which is fine, which is, you know, which is instructive. But I think that, you know, just watching, not only was it, I had to keep making it simpler. You know, it's like, say less, make it less complicated. But there was also, I mean, this was the New York Times, right? And I think the thing, you know, the other thing is that in our world, and readers of the New York Times is a group that's not just in New York, or not even in the Northeast. It's like that publication has a national readership, and people look to it for what they look to it for. But you know, I've heard this with my friends who write for and are trying to get publishing in New York, right, which is the center of the publishing universe, and so they have the best distribution systems. You know, it's like that's how. I mean, I was shocked when that piece came out. I didn't very much like it. You know, I didn't feel like it was me at some level, but like I got agents calling me, I got people offering me this and that, and this. I had people like getting my phone number. I mean, I can't imagine being in it every day. But I think the thing was that it didn't seem like we were trying to figure out the solution to the problem. You know, the problems that face us in terms of how people feel about their government, or how are people actually making decisions on who to vote for, or whether or not voting matters. It felt like it just feels so reductionist, even at this level where these people were the people I was working with were so smart, you know, but they were really good at keeping something focused. But it's like there are still a few core things, right? It's just like they can't imagine why people wouldn't want to be like them. And, you know, and they couldn't imagine. I think the other thing they couldn't imagine is that people who weren't like them were as smart as them, and that they were making that they were using their intelligence to make decisions. Sometimes, I mean, you know, it's just like, and also just that somebody was going to have to be the villain in this story, and so like, I mean, it's like we're all culpable. We're all culpable when people lose faith with their government in a democracy, right? It's like but it's just like the message-making centers are such a echo chamber, that they can't get outside of themselves and see how the rest of us see how people are figuring things out. And when they figure it out and make a decision that people disagree with, it's like our apparatus for negotiating with each other on that kind of civic level is just so broken. Where are our forums where people get together with people they disagree with and kind of figure out how to move forward together? I don't know. I don't care if I'm never in the New York Times again. It really did affect me. I'm like, this is not. I mean, of course, the other thing is then you get in there and you get in the comments. You spend 2 months working on this friggin' 400-word column, and within 45 seconds, you've got all this hateful spew coming out in the comments. It's like, if you ever don't read, everybody says don't read the comments. Don't read the comments. People are just mean and ignorant. Like smart people are so ignorant because they think they're smart. And so, anyway, I don't know how that. I mean, and what I say is, no political ideology has a exclusive hand on that kind of blindness of their own intelligence.
I have a question for you. All three of y'all from different regions and different backgrounds. How did that go into making the flow?
Well, so I'm not from Appalachia, as you can probably tell. And I've come into it through the idea of looking at the image of Appalachia, looking at the image of the hillbilly and its national construct. And why is it that it becomes, and just this perpetual image that never dies, right? I really thought that when I wrote my book, it was kind of, well, that's going to be the end of the hillbilly. And, that was back in the 90s. And just keeps coming back and keeps coming back and keeps coming back in all sorts of ways. So that was my interest in looking at it from that regard. And I saw myself in this book as, I'm the editor and I'm the facilitator, and I tried to bring together as many different voices as I could. But we made a map of the contributors, 40 contributors in the book, including photographers and poets and everything. And we made a map, and it stretches, well, there's some people are teaching at other schools now, so they're in California or Missouri. But we have a map from Alabama to New York, and from South Carolina to Ohio. I mean, it's a huge area. Appalachia is a huge region, and there's a lot of differences within it. And what we tried to reflect in the book is those differences. That it's not a single story, and that where you are, sometimes in very close areas where you are, makes a huge difference. Certainly where you are, in socioeconomic terms, whether you're still in the region or out of the region, all of those things. And that is the Appalachian story, and it's always been the Appalachian story. Appalachia's always been a place of out-migration, from its beginnings. So that story of the sort of spread of Appalachia-ness is part of the story too.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. When I sat on the panel at the Appalachian Studies Association conference, somebody asked afterward, but your story is just one story. And I'm like, yeah. The book has a lot of, well, at the time we didn't have a book, but
Right.
My response to that was that we need everybody's story. And I think what you're getting at, Tony, is that it's like a huge region full of lots of different people and huge diversity across race and class and gender and everything. We just need so many stories, and I think it's the only way to combat the simplicity of a story like Hillbilly Elegy, is to say, here is a book full of 40 different stories from different people from across this huge region, and then to just keep saying that over and over again and keep collecting those stories and telling those stories. That's hard, and it doesn't provide easy answers, but it's the only way in my mind to do it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. And then
So while the stereotypes of being a area in crisis or depressed area has certainly had negative impacts. It's also had beneficial impacts like the attention in the 60s and the war on poverty. How can we move forward past those stereotypes without losing the attention and benefit that they draw?
Well, I would say that a lot of that attention and a lot of that benefit only benefited certain people in the region. They largely benefited white people only and largely white men. So yes, it has brought that attention, it has brought those resources, but oftentimes those resources don't filter down to the people who most need them. I think it is a double-edged sword with these stereotypes, right? Like I know a lot of people put that out there as a way to get money here. I will say though that I work in this nonprofit world that helps Eastern Kentucky and Central Appalachia, and we still get a lot of funding. We still get a lot of money by telling the more complex story and by talking about solutions-based things that we're trying to do and not focusing so much on those stereotypical images. And I think that that investment will still come and that attention will still come. I think we just have to do it. We just have to switch the way that we're talking about it, because I don't think that's going to stop. I think it might just change a little bit.
I think that book that Ivy mentioned a minute ago, "To Live Here You Have to Fight," about women and activism in Appalachia, is a super good book. Not only is it tell a lot of stories of people who needed to be told, it also it's got some good kind of current analysis of how the 60s went down in the mountains, and there's all this influx of federal poverty money. And I think for me, and I think this goes to why people got frustrated with the left, with the Democrats, is that even when that help arrived, that when you got to the bottom of it, it was reinforcing a structure of the economy that allowed access to wealth and power to a relative few, and essentially, and in too many cases, people's agency, their ability to make their own way in the world, became tied up with how well could they work the system. And for people who just wanted to work, who just wanted to go to work and get paid and take care of their families, I think all of us know people or are people, that was enormously frustrating. That this idea that people didn't want, people were hurting, people were in poverty, people needed help, but they wanted somebody to help them get back to work. And, that has not happened yet, right? It's like that was the promise that old dude rode to the White House on, right? He's going to get us back to work. And, that'd been great. But I think if, one, I haven't seen it happen. Two, there's still the issue of people need a fair wage. They need health care. They need time to be with their families. They shouldn't have, we need good work. And I think that, the poverty programs, and this goes back to what I was saying before, we need to analyze what happened as a people and move forward and be smarter. Nobody wants to see anybody starve to death. Nobody wants to see babies in garbage cans. It's like we all want each other to get along. But I think that our political culture has gotten to where we can't sit down and figure out what worked and what didn't, and how do we do a 2.0 that's more effective. And I think it's because they're still trying to maintain the same power structure. That the same people are going to have all the money at the end of the day, and until something happens to turn that, it's going to be hard for it to get more just.
It's a lot about power and money. A lot.
And I think that, that one way to look at it is who enables us to do our own recovery. not who's going to decide how much recovery we get, but who's going to, I mean, and this goes right back to Mesa, you know, that this has been an institution in our region that's really been about us building ourselves up and not waiting for somebody to save us.
And we're not the only one. There's
They
many,
aren't.
many. Yeah.
You have one more question? I think you were waiting, ma'am.
Could you comment, there have been several references to out-migration from Appalachia, and, you know, if you're so bad off you want to, could you comment on your experiences with in-migration into Appalachia? Is that helping to reinvigorate the area? Are you getting more class distinction because of the kind of people that are moving in? Do you see people moving in who become really part of Appalachian culture, et cetera?
Yes and no. I think all of the above. I think in the 60s, for sure, there was a lot of in-migration of young people who are coming in through AmeriCorps and through the VISTA program. That still happens a lot, and we still get a lot of people who come into the region for that. In more recent years, Teach for America brought a lot of young folks in. So that's kind of what I see in my world of nonprofit world, is that we see a lot of those folks coming in. Sometimes they stay, sometimes they don't. I think it just depends on the person. You know, we also have a history of folks coming in and making their lives and their homes about Appalachia. Authors and artists, musicians, scholars, lots of people. I think sometimes people can get upset about outsiders coming in and you know, doing work that local people could do, or not staying for a long time or anything like that. But I think any kind of energy that comes into the place and tries to help the people build the kind of future that they want to build is good energy, mostly. Sometimes it's not. Yeah, I don't know. And I mean, I also think this notion of out-migration is not as big of a thing as people make it out to be. I think it's another one of these misleading narratives. Certainly there is out-migration. Certainly with the collapse of the coal industry, a lot of folks left to find work in other places. But I think most of the time people stay really close to home, and they just sort of move from county to county, and they don't go very far to find work, and to, you know, they want to stay close to home. And I think what I've seen too in recent years is young people who are from the region who went away to go to college or went away for work are coming back home to be in their communities and be a part of those communities. A lot of the people that are my age that are working at nonprofits in the region have that story, where they left to go to college somewhere or to work, and they came back and they're now working in this place and living in this place and are dedicated to making their lives there. So it's more complex, as it always is. Yeah.
You had one question. I'll just take that quickly.
Thank you very much. I was just curious if you have had any communication from Mr. Vance with regard to if he knows as much about the region as he acts like he does, he would surely expect that there would be.
Well, I mean, he was at the Appalachian Studies Conference. That was we talked about that a little bit in the intro. It was a very mixed reception, I should say. He was invited by some people in the association, so there were divisions within the association as well, for sure. But there was strong opposition to him as well, and he has not been part of this conversation. Again, although he had a TED Talk, I think, where was that? In Corbin, I think, yeah. And so, you know, but these attitudes continue. I mean, one thing I would say about Vance is I think one way he becomes the voice of the region is that he leaves it, and that he becomes connected to elite places like Yale and Amy Schwa and Peter Thiel and people like that. And then he becomes a legitimate voice of Appalachia, right? And so I think that's part of that echo chamber thing that Robert was talking about too.
He sent us a thank you note for boosting his sales.
And your reply to that was?
You're welcome.
Well, we want to thank you all very much for your attention.